Good afternoon and welcome to our In Conversation with the Under-Treasurer, Michael Carey. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll begin by acknowledging that we're in Brisbane on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the land you might be meeting us on from, and my respects to all First Nations people who are joining us online today. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Amy McVie and I'm the CEO of QCOS. Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'd also just quickly like to thank QUT Centre for Justice for sponsoring today's event. What we're going to do today is really have a discussion about how the budget is put together in Queensland, the state budget. I want to talk a bit through the process of putting a budget together, how best we as the community services sector can engage in the budget process, but also try and understand how the strength or prosperity of our state's economy is being shared with those who need it most in Queensland. And during an election year where we do have such a strong economy, and we also know from our frontline services that so many Queenslanders are under cost of living pressure and dealing with the housing crisis, it is incredibly important that we have a really strong sense of how these decisions are made and how we can influence them. Just some housekeeping items. We are broadcasting in Zoom webinar mode. We do have some pre-submitted questions, so thank you so much to the people who have submitted them already. But through this session, I can see questions coming through, and the Under-Treasurer is really keen to answer any questions that you might have as the session unfolds. This session's also being recorded, and so you'll have access to it after the event. So I might move now to introducing the Under-Treasurer, Michael Carey. Michael has had many senior roles in the Queensland Government, including in Department of Premier, previous roles in Treasury. He also has worked both in the private sector and the public sector and held roles advising government both at a state and federal level. Michael has a huge number of qualifications, including a master's obtained from Oxford and a Bachelor of Arts and Law from the University of Technology and a Bachelor of Commerce, Politics and Public Policy from Griffith University. It's really wonderful to have Michael with us today. Thanks so much for joining us, Michael. I might start just by asking you, I think it's 6 months into the role. I guess such a big role, and I know you've come from other huge roles as well, but what was it that attracted you to the role? What resonates for you personally with working at Treasury?
Yeah, look, a fair question. I guess at the outset, Queensland's Treasury has a mission statement about creating a strong economy for the benefit of all Queenslanders. That's something that resonates really strongly with me. That was a sort of driving force in me coming back to the state public service. So the opportunity to kind of work on that mission and work with other people to deliver that is a great opportunity and something I'm really proud to do. And if that's what I get to do each day, I'm really happy to do it.
And are there things being in the role that have surprised you so far? Things that you've learnt or things that weren't apparent when you started?
Look, I suppose from my perspective and in the Office of the Under-Treasurer, the two things I would call out are breadth and depth. I'd been a deputy in Treasury before. You feel like you have a reasonable understanding of what the agency does. But when you come to a job like this or a role like this in an institution like Treasury, you quickly realise exactly how broad the remit is and the nature of the activities that the agency undertakes, from sort of detailed actuarial insurance assessments to support the insurance for service providers and for the state, detailed policy work supporting cabinet and cabinet expenditure, highly operational data-based work in the Queensland Revenue Office, where the application of state tax laws and the state penalty enforcement register, it really does cover a very broad gamut, and that makes for an interesting day and an interesting week, and there's always something for me to learn, and there's always things that I don't understand. So I think breadth is really important. I think the other thing I reflect on every day, and I'm incredibly grateful for, is the depth of experience and skills that Queensland Treasury is able to bring to issues. I am a direct beneficiary of that. I'm by no means an expert in any of those fields, but a phone call away is someone who's worked in that field for 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 years, and that depth of corporate knowledge and that understanding of how the systems come to look like it looks, and the wise advice and counsel that they're able to provide you about dealing with current issues is something I get a great deal of personal benefit from, and it's a fantastic learning experience to be able to see and work with people who've got that experience. So the breadth constantly surprises me, and the depth that you have available to you as the Under Treasurer is incredible.
And so I guess, there's a huge amount of work happening in Treasury all year round. Only one of the things that Treasury is doing is putting together the state's budget each year.
Yep.
Would you be able to talk us a little bit through the mechanics, the time frames, the key steps? Like how do you put it together, Michael?
It's, art more than science, I think. Look, from a budget perspective, there are two products. There's a budget that's released in June each year. And then there's a mid-year update that is released in December each year. I guess within that broader budget context, there's kind of three jobs that Treasury does constantly. And whilst you have the two products a year, it's probably more like planning a ship in that you never actually stop. It's a job that keeps going. But the three jobs Treasury does is sort of number one, collects on a quarterly basis information about expenditure within departments and understanding what's previously been funded, how much has been spent for what outcomes, and keeps a very close sort of eye on how expenditure is occurring. And clearly, across a sort of $70 to $80 billion budget, there'll be faster expenditure and slower expenditure for a range of reasons. So that's a very important part of the kind of regular budget process to understand what's come in and what's gone out. I think the second part of the work that Treasury does is around forecasting and then acquitting against revenue. We have a range of revenue sources, from Commonwealth Government grants and GST payments to tax receipts across various areas. Whilst we forecast them at the start of the year, start of a budget year, we're certainly not wizards and we don't always get it right, and it really does require kind of constant and ongoing management to understand how those revenue sources are managing and holding up to the macro and microeconomic climates in various parts of Queensland. And then the third part of it is really understanding expenditure, and armed with what's already been funded, what might be available from a revenue perspective, managing and working with agencies on future expenditure projects and future expenditure opportunities, whether that's in response to crises or emergencies like disaster management or cyclones, or whether that's more measured, ongoing planned expenditure. They're the three kind of broad bits of the budget that need to come together, both structurally on a budget day in June, but then to be updated in December each year.
And last year we did notice that there was a bit more of a structured process in terms of collecting stakeholder submissions and timeframes around that. How is that how did that improve the process in terms of getting stakeholder views? And can you maybe comment a little bit on the engagement that you had from the community sector?
Yeah, look. Certainly, budget timeframes are often challenging, and it's quite difficult to receive submissions very late in the process, either when decisions have been taken or when other strategies to respond to particular issues have been formed. And certainly there was a desire to have a broader set of views available for consideration in this budget process, and that's what you've seen. From our perspective, we think that's a valuable process. Clearly, as with every budget process forever, not everyone gets everything that they ask for, and it's simply not possible to fund every worthy initiative that comes in. But armed with that intelligence from stakeholders and the views of stakeholders certainly allows government to form views and structure expenditure in a way that sees advice from a broader cross section of the community than might otherwise be provided. And in terms of the engagement to date, again, I think as a Treasury, we always get nervous because our capacity to fund every great idea is just not there, and there's always limits to what can be done. And we are constantly working with agencies and stakeholders about further developing opportunities, further developing options to get them into a form that are sort of investment ready and able for the government to support. And we'll continue to do that. It's a regular process. It's not over. It doesn't stop. So just because something doesn't come in this budget or in this budget update doesn't mean that the process of consideration or the efficacy of the proposal or the need for the support has gone away, and I think we accept that.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the process and sort of the measuring of or monitoring of the expenditure and outcomes, because I think when you're engaging with the process, you're more concerned about certainly from our sector's perspective, the submissions would relate to the outcomes that we want to see in our communities across Queensland. And as you know, there's been a real move toward looking at measuring wellbeing outcomes as part of a budgeting process. So having a framework that looks to the impacts that you're having on a wider range of things. And Jim Chalmers obviously put out his report last year, measuring what matters. What's happening in Queensland in terms of that movement towards like wellbeing budgets?
Yeah. Look. The Queensland Government's worked very hard, and Queensland Treasury has been at the forefront of it, delivering on some gender responsive budgeting work and backing in the women's strategy very strongly, and taking that gendered lens to the way in which we evaluate expenditure proposals and understanding what policy impacts we want to have and what policy impacts we might inadvertently be having in that space. I think that's a really good concrete example of work that we're doing in that space. Look, it potentially is a little bit controversial view, but I think in terms of measuring outcomes and accountability, whether it's state, federal or local government, there is a big accountability test that every government has to face, and the electoral cycle and the certainty of that electoral cycle really gives communities an opportunity to have their say about whether a state, a country or a local government is heading in the right direction. The individual measures, and certainly the Government Statistician's Office operates within Queensland Treasury, those individual measures are regularly reported and regularly published. One of the challenges, I think, for every government and every agency and organisation seeking to deliver community outcomes is there is a lot of data, there is a lot of statistics, and not all of them are as meaningful as they could be. So trying to make sure that we're collecting and measuring a consistent set of data over time to show progress is a really important thing, and it's not something I think we'll ever be finished with. And we're watching closely how the federal government rolls out that wellbeing approach to budgeting.
Yeah, so I think it's always something that our sector talks a lot about is how we need to invest before issues occur. So, taking youth justice as an example, that you would be investing in making sure that vulnerable families with children have what they need, have housing, kids are going to school, people aren't living in poverty, as a way to, first and foremost, make sure that everyone has an opportunity to have a good life, but also to prevent us having to make huge investment down the crisis end into things like prisons. How does the government, because there's always a tension there, is that you're investing in a financial sense, you're putting money down here so that you can save it in decades to come. How does government balance that investment that should deliver you a dividend in decades to come versus having to put money down the crisis end?
Yeah, look. I think it's an ongoing complex question, but the level and strength of investment in core delivery agencies like health and education are extremely strong in Queensland. Those agencies are at the front line of a range of those activities and a range of that early intervention work. The government's been out consulting, which I know you will be aware of and many of your members will be aware of, in relation to how better we can target that early intervention in that 0 to 8 year space. Clearly there's service delivery challenges that we need to confront and work through. We would say the investment is very strong. It's about tailoring the service offerings that we're able to provide and working harder between agencies to break down some of the barriers and silos associated with that service delivery, and seeing people and managing service delivery for communities on a time of life basis is a much more effective way, and something we're very supportive of in the early intervention process that's currently underway, because I think it sends a really clear message to agencies about our need to get around individuals at particular points in their lives, as opposed to taking a more siloed approach to service delivery and saying, well, my bit finishes there and I'm not interested in doing that. But I think the broader issues of flow through the criminal justice system as a system from start to finish is something that the government's worked hard at, and there's a range of initiatives that are seeking to do that. The early intervention work that's been announced in youth justice, whether that's in a co-responder sense, the MACPs, or the other significant investments we're making to empower local communities to make local decisions, in support of and around local families. I think they're all really encouraging signs from a service delivery perspective that bring together agencies to look at people as a unit, as opposed to considering them in a siloed way.
And how, because a lot of those examples that you now I'm really getting us into the weeds, I'm sorry, Michael, and we'll lift back up, but when you are making those investment decisions, I guess, about how to deal with those difficult social issues that we confront, how does government determine whether the investment should be in government or whether the investment should be in, say, for example, in community services that are embedded in community?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's always been a great partnership relationship between the community sector and the government. I think as we move forward, and I know there's great interest in changing and looking at and considering the procurement models that we use, I think we should always be open to those conversations, and we are. There will always be, whether it's in the community sector or in the private sector, there will always be a sort of threshold question for government about, do we do this or do we engage the support of somebody else to do it? And the more long term that service delivery, the more embedded that work is, I think the more inclination government has to do it itself. So there's a balance between that model where government gets the benefit of being part of government but has the disadvantages of being part of government, and certainly the agility and deep connection to local communities is something that the sector does well, and we acknowledge they do very well, and that's not something that's easily replicated in a government environment. So I think there'll always be a continuum. There'll always be a need for both, and how we manage those intersections and that friction area or the overlap area will be an ongoing conversation for government and the sector.
So you talked a little bit before about how the data that is collected is not always the best way of sort of keeping track of what's happening, and I think acknowledging that we could all get better at measuring outcomes, but based on the current state of play, how does Treasury what are the mechanics to really monitor the social impact of the investments that Treasury is making?
Well, look. I think there's probably three answers to that question. At an agency-based level, the service delivery statements contain outcomes and impact reporting across a range of agencies in a range of forms. They're not always perfect, and they're constantly under review, and we're always working with agencies about how those SDS measures are developed and implemented, and changes to the way government works and changes to the way government funded impacts those SDS measures. I think there are a range of core, from a Treasury perspective, a range of core economic data that really do give you a sense of the health, and they aren't measures of outcome, but they are proxies for community health, and whether that's employment or wages or cost of living, they're all good proxies for understanding how things are going. And then as you work through the various line agencies, there's a further set of data that give you an indication of the health of the health system, that give you an indication of the quality or the output in the education system. And, you know, as we move through, you know, youth justice and the courts and crime data and prisons, there's another set of indicators that kind of give you indications of how well government's going. I think it's very difficult to reduce community experience and the lived experience of a community into a number or a particular statistical measure. And in the end, all of those proxies come together to give us an indication of how things are going. The other thing I think which has been a great benefit and change over recent years is a much stronger focus on evaluation and evaluation forming part of programming at the beginning, you know, through the implementation and at the end. We certainly, you know, I'll be the first to admit we haven't solved all of those problems at this point, but we are actively working on it and thinking about how we embed that evaluation culture in the way we deliver services and spend money. Yeah. And that's something I think over time we can work together on.
So you were talking just then about the service delivery statements, which form part of the budget papers. Yep. So those of us who have, and many of the people online will have looked at the full budget papers and gone through the service delivery statements and seen that there's particular KPIs, I guess, within those for the agency to be measured against. Yep. So if you were looking, for example, at the Department of Housing service delivery statements, it would have things to do with the time spent on the wait list, for example. Yep. Can you talk to me a little bit more about how those KPIs are actually agreed upon?
Yep. Look, so there's two parts to the answer to that. I think in the first instance, you know, there's a range of historical measures that have been measured for a long period of time, and people are you know, comfortable or less comfortable depending on your view of the world about those measures being proxies for activity and outcomes within government agencies. So there's a range of those kinds of measures. As departments change shape and change focus, those measures are constantly looked at in the context of their strategic plan and the strategic outcomes that they've been asked to achieve by government, whether that's through the community objective setting process or whether that's through charter letters and other key documentation that communicate to government ministers the area of priority and activity that the government's asking them to focus on. So on a yearly basis, those things are reconsidered and re-looked at. As I say, I think some are sort of very well-established measures and well-established figures that people would be very uncomfortable if we changed and give you a temporal view of activity across sectors, but others are more open to change, and certainly they're reviewed on a regular basis by the agencies. Yeah.
So I guess moving on to the revenue side of things, you know, we've heard the government speak, rightly so, very proudly of the economic position of the state, saying that Queensland has the strongest economy of any jurisdiction in Australia. I think last year the Queensland Government delivered a $14 billion budget surplus, which is the biggest budget surplus delivered by any state or territory government ever. Where is that revenue coming from?
Yeah. Look, I think there's probably three sources of revenue. Clearly, the government's decision in relation to coal royalties and the application of a progressive coal royalty tax, combined with sort of some very unique macroeconomic circumstances, delivered significant revenue uplifts. The strength and ongoing, productivity and gains in the labour market is also a key indicator of revenue strength for us. So we've had very low unemployment in a range of places, and that results in revenue to the state. And to a lesser extent, ongoing strength in the property sector and transaction volumes, you know, feed into our revenue base. From a Commonwealth perspective, the the nature and size of the GST pool has a very direct impact on what the state collects. I understand we get very excited about big surpluses, but I think we do need to be sensible about how that revenue has been generated and what our long-term capacity to use it is. That is a very unique set of circumstances that delivered strong revenue in a period of time. Certainly the government, from our perspective, has done two things with that revenue. Firstly, they've been very generous in their cost of living approach and intentionally. So sort of $8 billion worth of concessions available, sort of $1.4 billion in energy rebates made available again on the back of that revenue. I think the second element of what the government has done is use that revenue to invest in productive assets. So the capacity that one-off revenue hit gives the state is the long-term capacity to invest in infrastructure to deliver policy outcomes. And you've seen that in a $10 billion hospital program, expanding capacity in the health network to deliver growth and new services for new Queenslanders. You've seen it in the energy transition, where the government has sort of committed, nearly $19 billion over the forward estimates to deliver a decarbonisation outcome. Major pieces of infrastructure in productive regional communities, like the connection between Townsville and Mount Isa and joining Mount Isa into the NEM, as well as significant expansions in the renewable energy portfolios of our government-owned energy corporations. So the other kinds of productive infrastructure investment that one-off hit has given us capacity to pursue, are things like Sunshine Coast Rail, are things like faster Brisbane to Gold Coast Rail, the ongoing delivery of Cross River Rail, which delivers productivity benefits to the community over a very long period of time, and much of that our capacity to nearly we've got a capital program over the forward estimates that's nearly $100 billion, sort of $99 billion at the last budget update. That's a significant lift from the $35 to $40 billion that's been the traditional kind of size of that program over that time. That our capacity to invest in those ongoing productive assets is really based on the use of that one-off revenue hit.
So I guess that's really interesting to hear you describe it as a one-off revenue hit, because I think, across the nation we hear conversations about how the growing pressure, I guess, on our health and hospital and housing systems, and then the economic position of different states, and how there's difficulties really for state governments to deliver or to address the pressure that they're experiencing. And then we hear in Queensland, that we have this incredibly strong economy, booming economy, strongest economy in the nation. Is it the case that you're saying that this is not a structural strength, it's a sort of point in time strength, and that the state is still has the vulnerabilities of the other states around the country?
Look, I think all state governments have an ongoing revenue and service delivery challenge. The revenue and service delivery challenge in Queensland is particularly acute because of the strong growth in community numbers. I think it's very clear that the interstate migration, people think Queensland is a place to be. That's true. We definitely think we have a strong economy with bright prospects, but the macroeconomic conditions that delivered those international coal prices are unlikely to be repeated constantly over time. So making sure that the windfall from that opportunity is invested in productive ways, and certainly the government's made the decision that supporting people on cost of living and delivering the big build and the longer term infrastructure renewal and expansion that a growing state like Queensland needs are two ways in which that revenue uplift has been applied.
And just to remind you, we are live at the moment, so I am encouraging anyone that has questions online to feed them through, so that we've got time to ask them so I've got time to put them to Michael. Michael, you talked a little bit about how that revenue had been invested into cost of living measures. Can you unpack a little bit more about what that has meant so far? So what kinds of investments have the state government made already to alleviate cost of living pressures for Queenslanders?
Yeah, well certainly at budget update last year, you saw freezes on registration and public transport fees, which are direct opportunities for people to save from their everyday expenditure. One of the most effective and efficient ways that the state can support community is through the energy rebate system that the government has operated. Last year, sort of $1.4 billion was delivered through that process. As a state, delivering that kind of direct support to people is actually often challenging. We're not the Commonwealth Government, and we don't hold the tax and transfer levers that they do. So getting support directly to people, needs to be carefully considered. But the energy rebate system that Queensland has built and operated has been a particular focus of delivering that cost of living relief because it's very effective and it targets Queensland as well.
And the free kindies program as well, I
Yep.
guess, is a good example of how the state government's been able to deliver cost of living relief to families. Has that made a difference?
Yeah, look, and in that social space, certainly free kindy has been a great boon for people in that space. The operationalisation and opening of satellite hospitals has also made some of that primary healthcare more accessible, closer to home, with the twin advantage of taking some of the pressure off emergency departments. So, in combination, those things are making a real difference to people's capacity to pay and capacity to spend money on other things as they get more expensive. And look, I think as we look forward to a slightly more benign interest rate environment and an environment where federal government tax cuts are going to flow in a much more focused and targeted way to people on low and middle incomes, there's hope to be optimistic about future cost of living increases.
So I know, it's out of scope to be talking about the future and what investments we might see this year, but we have heard the Premier and the Treasurer talk a little bit about what we can expect to see in June. I think I heard the Premier say that the budget will be the biggest cost of living budget we've ever seen. Can you give us any idea of what you think that would mean, particularly for people on low incomes?
Yeah. Look, I think you can get a fair sense of the government's approach from the decisions that it's taken, and that leads you to ongoing support around things like registration, energy, and kindergarten and education costs. I'm not going to get myself in the way of the Deputy Premier or the Premier in relation to what might be announced as part of the budget, but I think their comments give you a real flavour of their priorities, and obviously as an agency our job is to deliver for them.
Yeah. So I've got a question here from Stephen Clough from the Queensland Alliance for Mental Health, and I think it's relevant to this part of the conversation because we're talking about what can the government feasibly do as a state government to give cost of living relief, and we would say as a sector that our sector is at the forefront of providing support to people during a dual cost of living and housing crisis. It is the right time to be looking at how best to support the social services sector, and Simon's asking how the government's looking at our funding contracts and making sure that there's something sustainable there that sort of reaches beyond election cycles.
And certainly this was a topic well examined and explored in your budget submission, so thank you for that. Look, we will always look for ways where that we can procure services and skills and engagement with community in a way that benefits both the state, the agencies and the organisations that are delivering it, and the community. So we're very open to that conversation. We've touched on it in our conversation already I think there are some continuum questions, and one of the great benefits the state gets from engaging with community sector organisations is agility and speed to market. So that really relies on some flexibility, and that relies on the capacity of the state to be able to contract quickly and give agencies funding to respond to emerging or short-term or more short-term issues. We certainly hear the sector loud and clear that ongoing workforce retention, training and skilling, ongoing data collection and reporting against outcomes are benefited greatly by extending the life of those contracts and looking at alternative procurement models. As I say, I think at some point you bump into a situation where insourcing them for government becomes a real option. So getting that balance right is going to be important for us, but we certainly understand the sector's view, and we've heard you loud and clear in relation to the ongoing need for contractual certainty.
That's music to our ears, Michael. I have heard you say a few words back to me that I feel like
Something got in.
Yes, well received. That's very good news. So I guess what I wanted to sort of interrogate now was a bit about how the sector itself interacts with the budget process, and we touched on it before in that Treasury called for submissions due in November, so the sector sort of had a better understanding of when to put those submissions in and who to put those submissions into. Do you have examples of advocacy associated or work associated with the budget process which really has led to significant investment decisions or outcomes for Queenslanders? Yeah,
look, I think certainly a very recent example, very live and very relevant to a range of your members and people who work in the sector is the Queensland Housing Plan. That was a document and a policy process that was built over time through several summits and a range of roundtables and stakeholder engagement processes. That delivers the state, a good level of engagement across a range of forums with a range of people, and I think that's a great example of something that was built from the ground up and delivered by the state. So I think the housing plan is a great example. I think there are a number of others, and there's elements of that housing plan, whether it's in the homelessness uplifts and the ongoing engagement in the cost of delivering those services and understanding what that uplift might look like. Again, a very current example. As a broad observation, sort of stepping back, it's quite unusual for a big idea to appear in one budget, get done, get implemented, and then move on. Budgets are a process. State service delivery is a process, and it evolves over time. And the key message I would have, both from a submission perspective, but also from a how to deal with agencies and how to deal with government perspective, is that kind of zipper-based engagement is really important. If your engagement with the government is reliant on individual relationships, it's unlikely to be successful. So finding ways for agencies to engage at multiple levels in multiple ways is a really important way of us being able to better understand the agencies and organisations that we're dealing with, but also enables a more free flow of information that's not kind of limited to, here's my 2-page budget submission and I can't explain this complex issue in 2 pages, but there's people in line agencies or people in Queensland Treasury who understand it well and are able to frame and deliver outcomes in the budget process that work. So I'd really encourage that kind of zipper-based approach and coalitions of actively interested, whether it's a social services group or a community group or a set of local actors, they are very powerful and very valuable. So coming with a unified plan across a range of sectors or stakeholders is a very valuable thing for the sector to be doing. And responding to more than just a siloed particular approach. So I think they're some of the things that work best.
I think prior to this more sort of structured set of instructions about how to engage and put your submission in. The advice was to work kind of collaboratively with the line agency that the work is related to, and hopefully there can be some alignment between the agency and what the organisation is sort of seeking. Obviously, we would say that it's always worthwhile to engage in your peaks process of putting their submission together, because then you get that sort of collective piece. I wonder if there's things that you've seen happen that you think aren't ideal, or probably, what are the don't do's?
Yeah. Look, I think, and it can be frustrating, and I'm sure it is frustrating for many of your members and for you as a peak body. But government has multiple heads, and trying to make sure you're talking across those locations is very important. You can't always assume that because one part of government knows, the other part does as well, or that the other part supports or is encouraging of the view. So, certainly Queensland Treasury benefits greatly from direct engagement with whether it's QCOS or your individual member agencies. It's very valuable and powerful for us in the work that we're trying to do, even though we're not a line agency. So sometimes I think you can come a cropper by being too focused on an individual line agency and not broadening that discussion to take account of other perspectives, which may well be valid. So I'd encourage that. I think the other, from inside the government, and I get a sense from talking to you and your members that, from time to time there's frustration with the state in terms of the speed of its decision making and the things that we are able to do. I would say, it often takes time for the state to come to conclusions, and that whilst that is frustrating from the outside, and I completely acknowledge that, that usually results in better, more durable, more sustainable outcomes, and a longer term commitment to the kind of policy goals that you're seeking to advocate for. So it's more an ask than a opportunity, than something you need to do. But be patient with us. There are always competing priorities. There are always lots of worthy ideas, and sometimes it takes us a little bit longer to get to the finish line than I'm sure you would like, and I'm sure many of your members would like.
No, I'm just reframing. Patience becomes tenacity and determination, and don't give up. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think the other thing I was sort of thinking about when you were talking is, so it's an election year, and there will be a budget, and there will be numerous commitments of the current government reflected in that budget. And then post-budget, there's likely to be election commitments, promises made, subject to being re-elected or being elected. How does government sort of capture those commitments and then reflect them in the budget?
Yeah. So certainly once caretaker starts, there's a very well-established process run by the Department of Premier and Cabinet that collects and aggregates campaign commitments from both sides, and every agency is involved in the development of incoming government briefs for whoever might win the election, and those incoming government briefs are available to ministers sort of immediately. Campaign-based commitments aren't really captured in our process. Okay. They are questions for political parties to talk about how they might fund or support different commitments, and that usually becomes a matter of political controversy, and they go through that. Our job will be to publish the budget in June, and then publish an update in December, and I would expect that the outcome of the election will be known by December, and that update will take account of incoming policies of whatever government is formed.
And does that, if there is a change of government, does that sort of have an impact on timeframes? So where there's a structure at the moment where you'd be putting budget submissions in November, given our elections 26th of October, would you expect, if there were a change in government, that there would be a change in sort of the timelines for engaging in the budget process?
Look, probably not really for me to speculate.
Yes.
Budget timeframes and processes are unique to governments,
right.
and governments set those agendas and set those timelines, and certainly Queensland Treasury's job is to make sure they can deliver for the government of the day and meet the priorities that they're setting. So that'd be a question for an incoming Treasurer and Premier and a Cabinet or a CBRC.
Great. I do have a question here that's come in from Nathan Johnson from the Supported Accommodation Providers Association, and he's asking, can you provide insight into the government's thinking as it develops its foundational support strategy and priorities in relation to the NDIS?
Yeah, look, I think this is a big area of intergovernmental activity at the moment. There are so many very clear intersections between the NDIS, more traditional disability support services and our hospital systems. We're working closely with the Commonwealth Government and other states as we try and develop those strategies and systems. I think there's some water to flow under that bridge yet, and one of the key things that we are working collectively on is understanding where and how those services can be provided. And Queensland in particular has a very regionalised footprint of communities, and the regionalisation of those services in very thin markets is a real challenge, and that's something we're talking to the Commonwealth about, and certainly we're talking within government about.
Are there also other big areas of that sort of intergovernmental reform that's going on? I think I'm thinking of the education space, for example, that you could speak to a little bit.
It's an unusual time, and it's all very public. But there are a range of intergovernmental arrangements that are up for renegotiating and being discussed at the moment. Education is a critical one. Health is a critical one. Changes to the NDIS and other disability support mechanisms is a critical one. There's also a huge amount of work going on between the Commonwealth and the state in relation to energy, and all of those have sort of pretty deep service delivery and budgetary impacts. They're a usual thing in our federation, and they're a usual feature of the engagement that states and territories have. So we're working through those as quickly and in a detailed way, and certainly individual agencies are taking up those negotiations with Commonwealth colleagues, and central agencies like DPC and Treasury are working through their federation arrangements where appropriate to manage some of those matters. And clearly, from a Treasury perspective, the overall expenditure associated with those things and the Commonwealth support that comes with it is very important to us.
Yeah, and so how do you then coordinate, those kinds of negotiations that are happening at a Commonwealth level and with other states and territories, a federal budget and then a state budget? How can you possibly organise that?
Look. As I say, I think those processes are well known and well understood by the participants and the parties. Clearly, there's state and federal budget implications for a range of those things. So, trying to resolve those things in a way that allows for accurate and fair budget consideration is really important. But ultimately, all parties need to come to a resolution and a conclusion and be satisfied with the outcome. So, sometimes those things take their own course a bit and can be done very quickly, or might take a little bit longer.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much for shining a light on the very mysterious inner workings of Treasury and budget making. I'm sure everyone online has a better picture about some of the decisions that have been made, how they're made, and some of the things we can potentially look forward to this year. Thanks so much for referring to our budget submission, and as people online would know, every year QCOS develops a budget submission, and we do that through a really established engagement process, including our town halls, where we travel across Queensland and talk to our members in place about their priorities, the things that are happening. We develop those priorities and then go out again and get detail associated with those. We publish drafts. We talk to government, right across government, about those priorities and get further feedback. we collect that feedback and the feedback of our members and then finalise the papers and publish them. So that submission is available on the QCOS website. It does use cost of living language this year and has 6 priorities for investment by the state government, which we say on behalf of our members would help to alleviate the cost of living and housing crisis. Priorities include ensuring the community services sector is financially sustainable, dealing with Queensland's housing crisis, providing cost of living relief, whether that's through energy concessions, dealing with the digital divide, or providing further emergency food relief. We've got a paper around early years investment in youth justice services as an alternative to the justice system, particularly for younger children engaged in the justice system, and also investments that would address issues around women's equality. And it was really wonderful to hear Michael talk about gender responsive budgeting, because that's something that QCOS on behalf of our members did advocate for patiently in a determined and tenacious way, and it's wonderful to hear Queensland Treasury talk about the benefit of adopting that approach. Our budget submission this year talks about developing that further into procurement as well, so that government procurement as well as investment decisions can consider the outcomes for women's economic position in Queensland. So we are about to embark again on our town halls. I think the first stop is Townsville in the next few weeks, and we'll be travelling around Queensland to meet our members in place, and I'm really looking forward to doing that and to seeing you there. And I really encourage people to come along, because what we do hear from our members then really does inform the advocacy work that we take forward. After the budget, we do a great piece of work. I say it's a great piece of work because our team does really do a good piece of work, and it's not me, it's an amazing team. Our policy team looks carefully at the budget papers and does an analysis, which we then publish in time for our budget breakfast. It should be an incredibly exciting event this year, given we're likely to see the biggest cost of living budget ever, and hopefully see some of the things that you've all been advocating for a long, patient time reflected in that budget. So please do come along to the budget breakfast. We will include details. Tickets haven't gone on sale yet, but they will. And by the time we get our post-event email to you, the details of the budget breakfast will be in that email. So can I say thank you so much to everyone for participating in today's event, and a huge thank you to Michael for participating in the event today as well.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Have a great afternoon.